The wind moved like a whisper through the pine trees, a low hiss, stirring frost-covered needles as dusk fell across the endless forest. Somewhere beneath that green cathedral of silence, a story had been buried not by snow or soil, but by time. The Norse called them skogsmen, forest men, not quite spirits, not quite human. And in the world of the Vikings, so sure of their own strength, it was these unseen watchers who made the bravest warriors sleep with weapons in hand. No kingdom mourned their loss. No saga preserved their names. No graves marked their passing. Yet the memory of them remains, flickering at the edge of Norse fear, scattered through cryptic runes, fragmented lore, and the whispered warnings of 10th century scouts who refused to cross into the silent woods of the far north. They are the lost forest people, a tribe that lived alongside the Vikings, yet apart from them. And then they were gone, vanished without a trace. To understand the mystery, we must begin not with conquest, but with absence. The Norse were meticulous in what they feared. Their sagas brim with named heroes, cursed lands, and even the measurements of sea monsters' jaws. But here, in the northernmost reaches of Sweden and Finland, in the dense pine forests, stretching into the White Sea, they left only fragments. One such fragment comes from the saga of Olaf Tryggvason. In a brief aside, Olaf's men, traveling near the borders of modern Lapland in 995 CE, speak of those who do not show themselves, but mark trees with runes of bone and vanish into mist. Another, even more chilling, appears on a 10th century runestone discovered near Trondheim. Beware the ones who do not build. They move in silence and strike in darkness. They are not men, as we know men. Who were they referring to? These were not trolls or elves, as later Icelandic texts would romanticize. These beings, however mythologized, were drawn from memory of real encounters with a real people. A tribe that lived in the deep woods and snowfields the Norse dared not settle. Viking society was outward-looking, ocean-bound. Their longships surged down fjords and across the Baltic in search of trade, plunder, and farmland. But inland, the forests vast, unmapped, and filled with whispering winds, were another matter. While most modern histories fixate on the dramatic Viking raids on monasteries and cities, there were other conquests never completed. The Norse settled Iceland, Greenland, and parts of England. Yet the interior forests of northern Scandinavia and the tribes that lived there remained untouched. In Viking thought, the forest was not just wilderness, it was other. Where the sea promised glory and spoils, the woods held mystery. The word merk in Old Norse meant both forest and border, not just a place of trees, but the threshold between the known world and what lay beyond. So when the Norse ventured into these forests and spoke of being watched, of footsteps that left no tracks, of sounds that seemed to follow them, they weren't inventing ghosts. They were encountering a people so well adapted to their environment, so elusive by design, that their existence blurred the line between natural and supernatural. Who, then, were these forest people? No records survive from them directly. They left no sagas, no carvings of dragons or ships. But archaeology offers flickers of their world. In the peat bogs and rocky valleys of Finland's northern interior, researchers have uncovered small stone foundations, sunken huts that could be covered with turf and made invisible from above. The dwellings are tiny, often lacking hearths, suggesting brief, seasonal use likely by hunter-gatherers following game migrations. Nearby, caches of tools, flint blades, bone fishhooks, and sled runners made of pine hardened with smoke. No metal, no evidence of plowed fields. Yet these people lived here for centuries. In one notable case, a burial uncovered near Lake Inari revealed a body wrapped in reindeer hide, placed in a hollow of birch bark. and surrounded by antlers arranged like a crown. The grave dates to roughly the 9th century, the height of Viking expansion, yet the burial customs are unlike any known Norse, Slavic, or Sami rites. Genetic testing is ongoing. Linguistic traces are non-existent. This is how a people vanishes. Not in war, not in fire, but in silence. The Norse, for all their ferocity, were keen observers. They knew a worthy enemy when they saw one. And though these forest people never fielded armies or built fortresses, they commanded the greatest advantage of all, invisibility. Consider the account of Thoria, a Viking captain whose expedition into the woods of Biamians ended in horror. His saga recounts how, after 3 days' march through the forest, his party found their sentries' slain throats slit in silence, bodies arranged in spirals around the campfire. They saw no enemy. No one heard a step. One man reported hearing whispering in a language no one understood. 11 of 30 men returned alive. After this, Norse traders avoided the region for a generation. We do not know if the forest people meant to terrify, but to live unnoticed in the shadows, to master the land that terrified outsiders that was their gift and perhaps their weapon. By the 12th century, such encounters cease. The forests were cleared for timber. Christianity pushed deeper into the north. Trade routes shifted. Over time, the forest people disappeared, absorbed into larger tribes, scattered by war, or erased by the expansion of settled life. And yet, traces remain. In certain Sami oral traditions, there are mentions of vuavdeolmai, forest men, who could speak with animals and walk without sound. In rural Finnish folklore, tales persist of the metsänväki spirits of the forest, who once were human, now hidden watchers. And in isolated valleys, children still hear stories of pale-eyed strangers who come only when the snow is deepest. Maybe they're gone. Or maybe, like the bones beneath the frost, they are simply waiting to be seen. Part 2. Forest of Shadows. In the far north, the forest was not a place. It was a world, a living presence. An ancient and unmapped sprawl of pine, spruce, and birch that stretched from the fjords of Norway to the white rivers of Karelia. For the Vikings, whose power rose from shipcraft and open water, this realm of silence and shadow was both alien and sacred. They called it Myrkvidr, the dark wood, not merely for its absence of light, but for the veil it drew across the edge of their understanding. To enter these forests was to cross a threshold. The trees stood tall and narrow, their trunks blackened by centuries of resin and storm. Light filtered in only briefly during midsummer. For much of the year, the forest floor lay in twilight, carpeted with lichen, moss, and bones. Travel was slow. Paths disappeared overnight in snowfall, or under the clawing creep of undergrowth. Sound moved strangely here. A man's voice could vanish 10 feet from his lips. Snow fell so silently it seemed to devour time. This was where the forest people lived, not in villages, not in longhouses, but in the seams of the world between the rivers, beneath the ridgelines, beneath the bark. Their presence was inferred by absences, traps emptied of game, prints too light for Viking boots, smoke trails that faded the moment they were seen. Like wolves, they moved at the edges of vision, and like wolves, they were known more by what they left behind than by who they were. The Norse, despite their reputation for boldness, did not venture far into these woods without cause. Coastal raiding was predictable. It followed tides, moonlight, and the draw of gold. But inland, the rules changed. In the forest, they were not the hunters. They were the prey. The ancient Norse texts rarely describe these woods in concrete terms. But the Ynglinga saga, one of the earliest king's histories, hints at what the Vikings believed about the north. Beyond the rivers Where night lingers and the sun travels low, there dwell the others, they who came before us, who neither raise halls nor offer kinship. This wasn't metaphor. To the Viking mind, the forest teemed with consciousness, spirits of bark and stone, whispering gods of bog and beast. But the most feared were not gods at all. They were men or something like men who moved with animal grace, who hunted with silence, and who saw without being seen. Some sagas tell of Norse warriors losing themselves in the woods, only to return seasons later, changed. One tale from the Heimskringla describes a berserker who wandered into a pine forest to perform a ritual of Odin. He returned weeks later, naked, muttering in a strange tongue, with eyes described as pale as deathlight. His kin whispered that he had met the Skogsmen, and they had taken part of him. From the Viking perspective, the forest had laws, but they were not the laws of men. A longhouse was a symbol of order, a hearth, a beacon of life. But in the forest, light was swallowed. Fire gave away your position. Noise brought death. In such a place, only those born to it could thrive. And those who did had no need for conquest. They did not take land, because they moved with the land. They did not carve runes, because they had no need for written legacy. Their world was one of movement, memory, and myth. The environment they inhabited demanded it. Northern Scandinavia, particularly the regions around the Kola Peninsula, northern Karelia, and the upper Torn River Valley, were not just cold, they were volatile. Winters stretched to 10 months. Snow-buried trails, lakes froze thick as stone, and temperatures could drop low enough to freeze breath mid-air. But for those who knew its secrets, this world was not a prison. It was a fortress. These forest people did not build large dwellings. They constructed sunken pit houses, lined with stone and moss, sometimes roofed with bark or hides. These homes retained warmth, blended into the landscape, and left almost no signature from above, perfect for evading both predators and pursuers. Clothing was made from what the Norse called unclean hides: reindeer, fox, ermine, and even seal stitched with sinew and softened with pine resin. Each layer had a purpose: fur inward for insulation, bark or snow sealant outward for protection. Some garments were reversible: dark side out in the woods, white side out in the snow, camouflage before the word existed. Even their movement was engineered by nature. Wooden sleds, low and curved like animal bones, allowed them to move supplies silently. Snowshoes made from woven birch and sinew kept them aloft in deep snowdrifts. Skis, some found in frozen bogs and dated to the 7th or 8th century, were long and narrow, designed for speed over open snowfields and maneuverability through dense thickets. And it was through these forests that they moved not as wanderers, but as lords of their domain. Where the Norse traveled in bands and columns, the forest people moved in lines no wider than a man. They left no broken branches, no smoldering hearths. If they lit a fire, it was banked with stone and smothered in moss. If they killed, they removed the traces blood soaked into snow, tracks swept away with branches tied to their feet. The forest remembered nothing of them, but the Vikings did, not by name, but by fear. Runestones recovered near the Gulf of Bothnia contain fragmented phrases: "Do not stray from the coast," or "Where the pines are thick, keep the silence." These are not warnings against weather or wolves. They are social memory, carved into stone fragments of trauma passed from generation to generation. To the Norse, the woods were sacred but dangerous. They believed them haunted. What they feared most, however, were not phantoms. They feared the unknown, and few things were more unknown than a people who could vanish into the trees. The Vikings conquered much of Europe. They burned towns, took kings hostage, founded kingdoms from Dublin to Kiev. But in these forests, in the kingdom of snow and shadow, they were never masters. They were intruders, and the forest never welcomed intruders. Part 3. Not just Vikings, the land's first people. Long before Viking sails rippled on the fjords, long before Odin's name was carved into bone or stone, the north was already inhabited. The pine forests, the frost-shrouded valleys, and the inland rivers teeming with trout, these were not untouched lands awaiting the axe and the plow. They were already known, already named, by people whose memory now lingers only in the ice and moss. To understand the forest people the Vikings feared, the ones who vanished without a trace, we must look beyond Norse history. We must reach deeper, into the archaeological layers beneath the sagas, where remnants of a forgotten lineage wait like embers beneath snow. Archaeologists call them by many names: the sub-Neolithic, the comb ceramic culture, the Arctic foragers. But they were not just scattered bands of hunters. In the millennia before the Viking Age, they were the original masters of the North. Their ancestors crossed into the Scandinavian peninsula more than 9,000 years ago, following the retreat of the glaciers. They brought with them bone tools, reindeer hunting traditions, and a profound understanding of seasonal rhythms long before any rune was carved, and they never fully disappeared. In regions like northern Finland, eastern Sweden, and the Kola Peninsula, these early peoples adapted to harsh climates that even the Vikings found difficult to tame. While Norse settlers clung to the coastlines, clearing forests for farms and erecting longhouses, the forest dwellers remained mobile, elusive, and indifferent to the tide of expansion washing around them. They did not need towns or war bands. Their survival depended not on conquest, but on memory of the land, of animal migrations, of rivers that froze and thawed with the tilt of the earth. Their maps were not drawn. They were sung, walked, and remembered. Some scholars now believe these forest people were closely related to or ancestral to the Sami, but not all. Genetic samples taken from ancient burials in the far north reveal traces of a unique lineage, one that branched off from both the Norse and the later Sami, carrying a distinct blend of Eastern Eurasian and Paleolithic European ancestry, a people apart. They were here when the Norse arrived, and when the Norse wrote of pale-eyed spirits and snow walkers who leave no trail, they were likely describing memories of these ancient, liminal tribes. Take, for example, the petroglyphs of Alta, Norway, carved between 4,200 and 500 BCE, long before Norse settlement. They show humans in close communion with elk, reindeer, whales, and bear-like figures. They depict hunting from skis, net fishing from canoes, and shamanic dances beneath solar symbols. This was not merely survival. It was a world imbued with reverence, ritual, and meaning, a culture rooted in the forest as deeply as the pines themselves. And then there are the tools. At sites like Suomussalmi and Kemi, stone scrapers, antler harpoons, and birch bark baskets have been found layered beneath Viking Age artifacts. They suggest a people who lived lightly on the land, so lightly in fact, that they left few traces archaeologists can definitively follow. No monumental graves, no permanent hearths, just a few footprints in bogs, the char of a firestone, or a carved piece of antler lost in moss. This vanishing act was no accident. These people survived because they were invisible to the powers that rose around them. As Bronze Age warriors clashed on southern battlefields, and Roman legions carved roads through Europe, the forest people moved northward, deeper into the shadows, adapting again and again. Where others built kingdoms, they built silence. But silence is not absence. In the oral traditions of the Sami and the Kvens, there are stories of people who lived before us in the trees, not gods, not beasts, but those who walked quietly and knew the names of the stones. In some tales they are helpers, in others, tricksters or threats, always half remembered, always peripheral, memory blurred by time. Even in Norse sources, their presence glimmers like firelight in mist. The Vikings, pragmatic in battle but superstitious in spirit, referred to certain lands as obygðir, uninhabitable, but not uninhabited. In these places, warriors spoke of lights in the forest with no fire, of arrow shafts fletched with bird bones, and of watching eyes that vanished when confronted. The most telling sign of these forest people, however, may lie in what the Vikings avoided. Unlike their relentless expansion along rivers and coasts, Norse penetration into the northern interior remained shallow. Settlements in regions like Helsingland or Inner Lapland were rare and often abandoned within generations. Even armed expeditions, like that of Thoria into the White Forest, ended in retreat. It was not for lack of courage. It was because there was something or someone already there, and these occupants had no interest in parley, tribute, or glory. They lived by older laws. In time, many likely blended into Sami communities, or were erased by plague, Christian suppression, and the grinding wheel of modernity. But in the centuries when Norse power was at its peak, these forest people still moved through the trees, wearing furs stitched with bone, navigating by the stars and the memory of glaciers. To the Vikings, they were neither allies nor enemies. They were reminders that the land was older than ships, older than swords, older even than the gods. Part 4. Clues from the sagas. The sagas of the Norse are not history in the modern sense. They are memory distilled into myth, where truth flickers beneath layers of poetry and legend. Yet for all their dragons, seeresses, and divine tricksters, the sagas also preserve something far more fragile, echoes of encounters that history did not record, only remembered. And among those echoes, buried in the margins of Icelandic prose and scattered runes, are clues pointing toward the shadowy presence of the forest people. They are rarely mentioned directly, never named, but they haunt the sagas nonetheless. In the saga of Grettir the Strong, a tale overflowing with spirits, monsters, and lawless men, there is a curious passage. Grettir, outlawed and wandering through the north, seeks shelter in a wooded valley beyond the fjords, where no farm has stood in living memory. There, he is pursued by shapes in the trees, whom he cannot see but hears whispering in a tongue he cannot understand. The text does not elaborate. The moment passes, but the silence that follows is heavier than any battle scene. Another saga, Vatsdala Saga, tells of a Norse settler, Thorstein, who establishes a homestead near the edge of a deep pine forest. In the second winter, his livestock go missing. He blames wolves until he finds bones arranged in patterns around his property and carved wooden figures placed at the edge of his pasture. Thorstein burns them. That night, he dreams of a pale man in antlered cloak standing by his hearth. Come spring, his longhouse burns to the ground. The saga attributes it to madness. But older versions of the story, recorded in regional oral tradition, speak of Skogsbarn, forest children, and warn settlers not to disturb their markers. The Norse believed in boundaries not just physical, but spiritual. Certain groves were vey, sacred places where oaths were spoken, and blood might not be spilled. Others were simply avoided, not because they were cursed, but because they belonged to someone else, someone no longer seen, but not forgotten. Perhaps the clearest saga reference comes from a fragment known as the Erbygja manuscript, likely compiled in the early 13th century. It speaks of a coastal family whose ancestors made pact with the men of the White Woods to ensure safe passage through a trading trail in inland Norway. The text then adds cryptically, "They gave no gold nor silver, but left deer meat and birch cord, and burned no pine upon that path." These instructions are practical, not religious. They suggest custom, the memory of a real relationship between Norse travelers and a now vanished group whose ways required careful respect. Not all clues come from manuscripts. Some are carved in stone. At the edge of the Trøndelag forests, a 10th century runestone bears the inscription, "Here we mark the place beyond which we do not go, where the snow remains in summer, and watchers need no fire." Another, found broken in northern Helsingland, reads simply, "We leave this land to the quiet ones." What kind of people inspired such fear not of death, but of crossing a line that could not be uncrossed? Unlike typical Viking enemies, Saxons, Slavs, Franks, these quiet ones are never described in terms of battle. There are no tales of skirmishes or glory. Instead, the tone is one of apprehension, respect, even dread. When the Norse faced warriors, they told tales of combat and conquest. But when they faced something unknowable, something that did not fight on their terms, the sagas grew silent or strange. Modern scholars have long debated whether these mentions refer to spirits, animals, or hallucinations, but growing archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests that some were rooted in real encounters, not with phantoms, but with people who lived by different laws, people who vanished when approached, people who had no need to speak the Norse tongue because their silence spoke louder. The term skoggermen, or forest men, appears in several Norse texts, though inconsistently. In some cases it refers to outlaws, men who flee society to live in exile, but in others it carries a more elemental meaning. In the Volsunga saga, the hero Sigmund hides in the woods and encounters a man with bark-covered limbs whose eyes shine like winter stars. The saga does not name him, but the image is potent, a figure not of this world, but not entirely outside it. Likewise, in the poetic Edda, the forest is often a liminal space where the gods meet fate, where heroes go mad, and where the dead are closest. It is in these margins that the memory of the forest people survives, not as individuals, but as presence, as boundary, as the other. Even in tales where they do not appear, they shape the landscape. Characters avoid certain rivers. They travel in groups when crossing specific groves. They leave offerings at crossroads deep in the woods, not to Thor or Frey, but to something older, something unnamed. Why did these memories persist? Because the fear did. To the Norse, to be feared was to be powerful, but to inspire fear without violence, to be spoken of in hushed tones without ever drawing a sword, that was another kind of strength entirely. The forest people, though they left no saga of their own, became ghosts in the Norse imagination. Not evil, but unfathomable. Not enemies, but something more unnerving. People who could not be conquered, because they had no interest in conquest. People who disappeared, not in death, but by choice. The sagas never tell us where they went. Perhaps they didn't go anywhere. Perhaps they were never meant to be found. Part 5. Invisible by design. To live unseen is a skill. To remain unseen across generations is a culture. The forest people, the Vikings, feared those who left no name, no monuments, and no flag upon the land were not simply elusive by chance. They were invisible by design. It was not weakness, but intent. Every aspect of their lives, their clothing, shelters, movements, even their fires was shaped to avoid detection. Not out of fear, but out of a deep understanding that survival in the northern forests depended not on dominance, but on disappearance. For the Norse, visibility was power. Chiefs wore rings of silver, carried swords with pattern-welded blades, and built great halls of carved timber to project authority. Even their dead were displayed in boat burials, with weapons, animals, and treasure, as if to shout across the ages, "Here I was, remember me." The forest people built nothing meant to last, and yet they endured. Let us begin with how they moved. In the boreal north, where deep snow covers the ground for most of the year, ordinary boots are a liability. Viking leather soles crunched loudly on frost and sank into powder. But archaeological discoveries from sites like Utsjoki and Lovozero reveal a different approach. Snowshoes crafted from birch and reindeer sinew, designed to spread weight over a wide surface. With these, a person could glide silently over deep snow, leaving only the faintest indentation. Some finds include crude ski-like planks, curved at the front, smeared with pine tar or animal fat to reduce friction. Unlike modern skis designed for speed, these were optimized for quiet traversal in dense forest, a hunter's tool, or perhaps a scout's. Their shelters were equally subtle. Rather than longhouses, which stood tall and gave off smoke easily visible against the snow, the forest people used semi-subterranean dwellings. Excavations in Lapland reveal pit houses sunk into the earth, often no more than a meter high, with roofs of turf, bark, and snow. From 10 paces away, they looked like a mound or a hillock, indistinguishable from the forest floor. These shelters retained heat more efficiently and required less fuel. Smoke from their fires was funneled through horizontal stone vents and released at ground level, dispersing it into the underbrush. A Viking scout, trained to look for chimney trails, would see nothing, hear nothing. Even their fires were different. The Norse built central hearths, open flames that served as both heat and light. The forest people employed what modern bushcraft calls a Dakota fire pit, 2 small holes dug into the ground, connected by a tunnel. The fire burns below the surface, and the secondary hole acts as a vent, feeding oxygen to the flames and minimizing smoke. No glow, no silhouette, heat without a beacon. In the artifacts, we do find bone needles, fish hooks, small polished stones. There is a consistent theme: portability. Everything was light, multifunctional, and easy to carry. Even their tools spoke of motion, not settlement. Most had no permanent base. They moved with the herds, with the meltwater, with the stars. Clothing, too, was not merely practical. It was tactical. Reindeer hide, worn fur-in for insulation, was layered with outer garments dyed in shades of ash, moss, and pale bark. Some items reversed white for the snow, dark for the trees. Hoods extended forward, breaking the outline of the head. Gloves had stitched fur palms to mask the feel of skin. Everything was quiet. No clinking metal, no exposed buttons. Fasteners were made of bone and horn, tied with sinew, designed not to rattle. They wore the forest like a second skin. But perhaps most impressive was their ability to erase their own passage. At the edge of Lake Inari, a recent excavation uncovered the remains of what appeared to be a temporary campsite: fire-blackened stones, scraps of hide, and a circle of birch poles. Yet all around the camp was something even stranger: bundles of twigs tied into fans, stained with resin and worn smooth. They were brooms, branch sweepers, lashed to the feet and dragged behind to erase tracks. Imagine the skill, the time, the discipline required to maintain such a way of life, to move through the world without leaving a mark, to carry fire without smoke, tools without sound, homes without walls. This was not primitive. It was mastery of stealth, of material, of environment. The Vikings, for all their brilliance at sea, could not match this. When Norse warriors entered the forest, they brought the rhythms of open battle: clang of iron, ring of shields, the roar of confidence. But the forest was not a battlefield. It was a test. The louder you moved, the more it rejected you. The more you forced yourself upon it, the more it consumed you. Some Norse texts speak of the men who left no scent. Others tell of footprints that led into snow and vanished, not blown away, but lifted. A man carried, perhaps, or a deception so perfect it bordered on myth. Yet behind these tricks lay no magic, just generations of learning passed down by imitation, not inscription. the child who learned not to cry when cold, the young hunter who learned which ice cracked under weight and which held firm, the elder who could navigate by moss on a tree or the flicker of a snow hare. To the Norse, this was unnatural, perhaps even supernatural, but it was neither. It was a philosophy to live lightly, to vanish by becoming part of the world others tried to conquer. The forest people needed no walls, because nothing could find them. They needed no weapons, because they were never there when danger came. They had no graves, because their remains returned to the forest long before bones could be found. They left no trace, because that, above all, was the point. They were invisible not because they hid, but because they knew. In a world built to be seen, the greatest power is to pass through unseen. Part 6. Their world. A hidden civilization. Imagine a civilization without cities. No towers to scrape the sky. No walls to mark territory. No roads to carry the boots of soldiers or the weight of wagons. Imagine a people whose homes disappeared with the season, whose trails were never carved in stone but in memory, and whose presence was so delicate it blurred into the land itself. The forest people were not a primitive tribe clinging to survival. They were a civilization not in the way empires would define it, but in a form older, quieter, and more symbiotic. Their world was not measured in wealth or conquest, but in continuity. For generations, they lived beneath the canopies of ancient pines and birch, in an ecosystem they neither ruled nor fled from, but inhabited like breath in a lung. To enter their world is to abandon the familiar metrics of power and permanence. There are no throne rooms here, no temples of stone, but there are rituals etched into snow patterns, preserved in birch bark shrouds, whispered through the flickering light of resin-fed fires. Their dwellings were temporary but sophisticated. Archaeological sites in regions like Kusamo and Panahervi reveal post holes set in perfect circles, suggesting dome-like structures made from flexible saplings bent into shape and covered with bark, hide, or moss. These shelters, similar in design to Sami Gawati, but even more minimal, could be constructed in hours, packed onto sleds, and rebuilt wherever needed. They required no nails, no iron, just knowledge, passed down in silence. Even their camps followed a rhythm. They were placed near seasonal migration routes of elk, reindeer, and birds, yet always on the leeward side of lakes or hills, where smoke would drift away from the game. They chose groves where lichen grew thick and edible roots could be found. Water was gathered not from rivers directly, which left trails, but from collecting snow and ice in hide-lined baskets. Camps were often disassembled before leaving a gesture that seemed spiritual, but was likely practical, denying enemies a trace, and the forest its balance. If the Vikings measured prosperity in hoards of silver and livestock counts, these forest dwellers did so in knowledge. Which birch tree gave the smoothest bark for wrapping smoked fish? Which fungus grew only on dead spruce in early spring? Which birds called in which order before a storm? Theirs was an oral architecture. No rune stones, no scrolls, but memory maps carried by elders, perhaps encoded in song, rhythm, or gesture. Among the Sami, even centuries later, it was common to transmit geography through joy-haunting chants that described not just places, but emotions attached to those places. It is plausible the forest people practiced something similar. Their songs, now lost, would have been archives of terrain, season, and survival. Tools found in their former territories: bone awls, stone scrapers, fish traps woven from willow were specialized but never mass-produced. Each was tailored to a task, region, or person. Many were adorned with incised marks, not decorative but instructive. One bone harpoon head found in Savukoski bears notches along its spine, aligned with anatomical landmarks of the fish it was meant to kill. Function and teaching tool combined, and they had ceremony. In a moss-covered pit burial near Lake Pialinen, dated to the late 800 CE, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a man wrapped in fur, surrounded by antler fragments carved with spiral symbols. At his feet were a bundle of dried mushrooms, possibly Amanita muscaria, and a small wooden bowl smeared with dark residue. There were no weapons, no gold, but the positioning, the artifacts, the care all suggest a ritual, not a burial of status, but one of knowledge. This may have been a shaman, or a memory keeper, someone whose role was not to lead in battle, but to maintain the balance between the people and the world they inhabited. In a culture without borders, leadership flowed not from dominance, but from memory. They had art too, though it lived and died with the seasons. On a boulder deep in the Laponian woods, a red ochre figure still clings to the stone. It depicts not a man or animal, but a pattern, concentric loops surrounding a tree-like form. It matches no known Norse or Sami symbol. No one knows what it means, but someone painted it. Someone stood there, centuries ago, and marked a memory into stone. These people are sometimes dismissed in academic literature as transitional, as if their refusal to settle, farm, or forge iron was an evolutionary shortcoming, but perhaps it was the opposite. Perhaps their way of life, dynamic, adaptable, invisible, was the final expression of balance between humanity and the wilderness, a way of living not in dominion over nature, but in concert with it. What kind of civilization can thrive for thousands of years and leave no empire, no collapse? The kind that never builds above the tree line. The kind that sees the forest not as a barrier, but as a home. The kind whose greatness was not seen but felt in the hush of pine needles falling, in the movement of mist between trees, in the silence that made even the Vikings pause. Their world did not vanish. It faded like firelight as dawn approaches, like footprints in melting snow, and perhaps that was the point all along. Part 7. Language without letters. Language is memory made audible. It carries not only the names of things, but the beliefs, fears, and lifeways of a people. Yet of the forest people, the Vikings feared those who vanished into the trees. Not a single written word survives. No carved runes, no tablets, no marks in clay or ink, nothing. And yet they spoke. They must have. The absence of a written record is not silence. It is a different kind of speech, one built on breath and body, on gesture and shared experience. To live without letters is not to live without language. It is to live with a language that does not need to be preserved in stone, because it was always carried in the flesh. Some scholars suspect these forest people spoke a precursor to one of the Uralic languages, a linguistic family whose most well-known northern member is Sami, spoken still in parts of Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Russia. Others believe their speech may have belonged to an even older stratum, a Paleo-Siberian echo, long since swallowed by waves of migration and assimilation. The truth is, we do not know, but the clues, faint and scattered, are there. One of the most compelling hints lies in the place names of northern Scandinavia and Finland. Linguists have identified hundreds of toponyms, names of lakes, rivers, and hills that do not derive from Old Norse, Sami, or Finnish. These orphan names, as they're sometimes called, have no known linguistic origin. They are ancient, immovable, like stones embedded in language. In some cases, they cluster around regions historically rich in archaeological remains of non-Norse, non-Sami settlement. A few resemble root words in extinct languages from eastern Russia and the Siberian steppe. Could these be the fossilized remnants of a lost tongue? Perhaps. And if so, they are among the last words of a people who never sought to preserve themselves in writing, but in place letting the land hold their voice long after the body was gone. Consider the way knowledge was likely passed in such a culture. Without writing, everything depended on memory, not rote memorization, but embodied repetition. A boy learning the hunting routes did not read a map. He walked the trail at his father's side until his body knew the distance between landmarks. A girl learning to snare birds learned by doing, her hands repeating movements until they stitched muscle to meaning. In such societies, language is inseparable from action. We see this still among traditional Sami Sita communities, where herding knowledge is communicated through subtle terms for snow, ice, and weather. Some dialects contain over 200 words for reindeer, each describing not only appearance, but behavior, age, temperament, and role. This linguistic complexity evolved in an oral culture, without books, born entirely from necessity and intimacy with the natural world. The forest people likely had something similar. Their vocabulary must have been rich in words we no longer need for the curve of a river under snowmelt, the angle of a hare's track after freezing rain, the sound of birch sap rising in spring. They would have had no word for conquest, but many for hidden, no word for border, but several for safe place. Among the Sami and other Arctic peoples, speech is often accompanied by gesture, not to emphasize, but to encode. The lift of a brow, the flick of a hand, the angle of a glance can all signal intent. In the forest, where sound carries and silence saves, such nonverbal language can mean the difference between life and death. The forest people's language may have included whistles, throat clicks, and low hum sounds that travel quietly through trees or mimic bird calls. Among the Kevin and Komi peoples to the east, similar techniques are still used today to communicate across distance without drawing attention. Even their stories, what little survives in the margins of Sami folklore, are structured as riddles, metaphors, or songs, suggesting a culture that preserved truth, not through direct statement, but through indirection. There is one final clue. On the inner surface of a reindeer antler fragment found in a peat bog near Inari, archaeologists discovered a series of tiny notches almost invisible, carved in rows, too regular to be random, too shallow to be decoration. Some believe it was a lunar calendar, others think it was a memory aid, a tactile record meant to be read by hand, not eye. If so, it may be the closest thing we have to a forest people document, but it isn't writing, not in the way the Norse understood it. The Vikings carved their sagas into runestones and spread them across the lands they conquered, cold, unyielding monuments to memory. The forest people carved their legacy into flesh and rhythm, into song and snow, and when they left, they took their language with them, locked behind lips that no longer speak. And yet, in the orphan names of lakes, in the patterns of movement passed through reindeer herders, in the stories whispered to children on the edge of sleep, we may still hear echoes of that lost voice. Not a silence, but a language without letters. Part 8. The Reindeer Riders. In the far reaches of the north, where pine forests give way to windswept tundra, and winter reigns for most of the year, the forest people shape their lives around an ancient partnership, not with horses nor oxen, but with reindeer. To the Norse, whose world was built around ships and plow beasts, the idea of riding a reindeer must have seemed absurd, but in the deep silence of the taiga, where snow fell thick and the ground never thawed, it was not just practical, it was revolutionary. They were the reindeer riders, and their mastery of this fleet-footed animal gave them a kind of mobility and adaptability that the Vikings, for all their famed engineering, never truly matched. While reindeer herding is most famously associated with the Sami of later centuries, archaeological evidence suggests a much older relationship. In regions like the Kola Peninsula, Karelia, and northern Finland, antler fragments shaped into harness pieces, sledge runners, and ceremonial carvings date back over 2,000 years. These finds predate known Sami domestication practices and point to a long evolving bond between human and herd. To the forest people, the reindeer was not a possession, it was a partner. Fast, sure-footed, and able to navigate deep snow and thin ice with grace, the reindeer could carry supplies, pull sleds, and, when trained, even bear a small adult rider. They were uniquely suited to the landscape, able to feed on lichen buried beneath snow, to sense changes in weather, and to migrate across hundreds of kilometers with uncanny precision. In winter, when Viking travel all but ceased and longhouses were sealed tight against the cold, the reindeer riders moved freely, their sleds low, curved frames lashed with rawhide glided silently over snow and frozen lake. With reindeer harnessed in single file, they could weave through trees at surprising speed, each animal responding to voice clicks, whistles, or subtle rain pressure. A well-trained reindeer did not panic at predators, nor bolt like a horse at the scent of bear or wolf. Imagine the effect this had on Viking perceptions. A Norse raiding party trudging through deep snow hears a sound faint at first, then gone. A few heartbeats later, one of their number lies dead, an arrow protruding from his throat. They find no tracks, no trail, only the faint vanishing marks of a sled's passage, and even those swept clean by morning. They speak of spirits, of forest ghosts, but it was none of those. It was a man or woman riding behind a reindeer, bow in hand, vanishing before the Norse even knew they were seen. This mobility allowed the forest people to move in patterns alien to their enemies. Where the Norse depended on rivers, roads, and seasons, the reindeer riders followed the internal calendar of the herds. They appeared in regions thought uninhabited, crossed frozen rivers in silence, and departed before Viking scouts could track them. It also gave them trade leverage. While the Norse built coastal networks of goods and coin, these inland traders transported amber, furs, mushrooms, birch tar, and herbal medicines across vast northern routes. They connected hunting tribes with fishing settlements, nomadic clans with more sedentary river folk. Their sleds carried goods the Norse could not reach, not without risking men and morale. One Norse account written by a merchant named Ulfr, whose notes survive only as fragments quoted in later texts, tells of a winter journey north, seeking rare fox pelts. He writes, "The men who met us came not from village or ship. They came upon deer without fear, dressed in white, and spoke not the tongue of man. Their leader bore no iron, yet our own guard refused to lift sword against him. Ulfr paid well. He received furs, dried mushrooms, and smoked fish in return. The dear reindeer were gone before dawn." His final note reads, "They knew the forest better than gods." There is reason to believe that the reindeer were more than transport. They were spiritual beings, intermediaries between the human world and the forest's deeper mysteries. In some Sami traditions, which may preserve echoes of earlier beliefs, the reindeer is seen as a dream guide or spirit vessel. Shamans are said to ride spirit reindeer in trance journeys, crossing between realms. Antler motifs appear frequently in burial goods, ritual sites, and carvings found in places no Norse would ever go. A burial site near Lake Kitali contains the remains of a young woman laid on a bed of spruce boughs, with a reindeer skull placed at her feet and carved bone pendants around her neck. The grave dates to the 9th century, the height of Viking expansion, but no Viking artifacts were found, only forest-made tools, hide clothing, and a sled fragment lashed with birch fiber. The woman was likely a forest person, perhaps even a reindeer shaman, a rider between worlds. This lifestyle, so alien to Norse culture, was not backward. It was brilliantly suited to the land. The forest people did not need roads. They did not need iron hooves or oxen or carts. They had what the North gave them, the reindeer swift, strong, sacred, and in their hands, the reindeer became more than a creature. It became the means by which they moved beyond the reach of history. In time, the practice faded. Climate shifts, Christianization, and colonization pushed the old ways into the margins. But even today, in the northernmost reaches of Scandinavia, among the Sami herders who still guide their reindeer across ancient trails, there are stories not written, but sung of those who rode the deer through the deepest woods and vanished before the snows melted. Not spirits, not myths, but reindeer riders, the forest people who chose to live on the move, and in doing so, slipped from the pages of Viking history like breath into pine. Part 9. Plants, Potions, and Forest Lore. In the forest, every leaf was a page, every root a word, and every mushroom a secret waiting to be learned. For the forest people, survival was not merely a matter of hunting or shelter. It was about knowledge, deep, intimate, ancient knowledge of the natural world. And nowhere was this more profound than in their use of plants. The Vikings, for all their seafaring glory, were not herbalists by nature. Their medicine relied heavily on imported remedies, animal fat, and prayer. But the forest people lived by a different tradition, one grounded in subtlety, observation, and the slow accumulation of wisdom. To them, the woods were a vast, living apothecary. Archaeological studies of their former homelands, particularly in the peatlands and glacial valleys of northern Finland and Karelia, have uncovered the preserved remains of plant bundles, dried leaves, bark shavings, and roots carefully wrapped in birch bark or reindeer hide. Some of these specimens were identified as meadowsweet, used for pain relief, bog rosemary, a sedative and mild hallucinogen, and angelica, a multi-purpose herb with antimicrobial properties. Others remain unknown local species whose uses may be lost to time. They also harvested lichen not as food, but as bandages and poultices. Iceland moss, in particular, was used to treat chest infections and wounds. The forest people learned to boil it with animal fat into a paste, or dry it into cakes for later rehydration. Crushed spruce needles were another favorite, rich in vitamin C, essential in winter, and also useful in washing wounds. The resin itself served as an antibacterial salve and a glue, but their botanical mastery went deeper into realms the Vikings considered dangerous, even sacred: the use of mind, altering plants. Among the finds from sunken forest shelters are small, charred remnants of what appear to be smoking bowls. Some contain residue matching Amanita muscaria, the red and white-capped fly agaric mushroom, known for its psychoactive effects. Others contain traces of Ledum pallister, known as marsh rosemary or wild rosemary, a powerful hallucinogen when burned or brewed in small quantities. In Norse tales, berserkers, those frenzied warriors who fought with inhuman strength, were often believed to use such substances. But few Viking communities had access to the knowledge or the caution needed to handle these plants safely. The forest people, however, seemed to wield them with precision. They used these mushrooms not for battle, but for vision. The line between healer and seer was thin. In many Arctic shamanic traditions, still preserved among the Sami, plant knowledge is not separate from spiritual knowledge. A healer did not merely treat a wound. They treated the balance between the body and the world. And for this, altered states were often required. Imagine the forest rites: a birch shelter filled with pine smoke and flickering firelight, a shaman face painted with ash, antlered headdress crowning their brow drinks from a carved wooden bowl. Around them, reindeer hide drums beat in slow rhythm, echoing the heartbeat of the earth. The herbs take hold. Vision blurs. They walk between worlds, seeking the source of illness or the answer to a dream. Vikings who stumbled upon such rites often misinterpreted them. In Norse sagas, these figures become witches, trollkonur, or forest spirits. But they were something else, keepers of lore so deep and localized it could not be written, only lived. Their rituals weren't theatrical. They were functional. A woman giving birth in the forest might be surrounded by willow bark incense, a natural painkiller. A dying elder might be given dried reindeer lichen and cloudberry to ease their passing. A hunter before a long journey might chew wild juniper for stamina and clarity. Even their food blurred into medicine. Chaga, a charcoal-like fungus that grows on birch, was brewed into tea for strength. Nettles, bitter but rich in iron, were ground into soups. Lingonberries and crowberries were fermented slightly and eaten to stave off scurvy. They also carried amulets of carved root or bark, often wrapped in sinew and worn close to the skin. Some were simple symbols of plants carved into softened birch wood. Others were more intricate, tiny satchels containing herbs, teeth, or moss, thought to ward off illness or guide spirits. One such amulet was found near the border of modern Finland and Russia, preserved in permafrost beside a burial. It contained a ball of pine resin, wild thyme, and a feather from a black grouse. These were not trinkets. They were codices, living books of forest knowledge. Much of this lore was gendered. Among forest people, as among many indigenous societies, it was the women mothers, grandmothers, and midwives who maintained the plant lore. They passed it through touch and repetition. How to strip willow bark, how to identify nightshade by leaf texture, how to dry mushrooms without spoiling. Daughters learned by watching. Sons remembered through the meals and treatments they received. The forest taught them everything and demanded nothing less than complete attention. To use a plant without knowing its mood, its season, its spirit that was a mistake that could kill. The forest people learned slowly, over centuries, from trial, from success, from loss. And in doing so, they assembled a pharmacopoeia unmatched in the Viking world. When Viking explorers met them, they often spoke not just of the people, but of their smell, sharp, herbal, strange. Their skin carried the scent of resin, dried leaves, and burning bark. Not like men, more like trees. To the Norse, that was alien, frightening. To the forest people, it was simply home. Their medicine did not come from books. It came from the ground. From the bark peeled in spring, the lichen scraped in summer, the mushroom plucked on the third full moon. It came from patience, from observation, from reverence, and it left no trace except in bones that healed, fevers that broke, and dreams that still echo in northern winds. Part 10. Forest warfare ghosts with spears. When the Norse went to war, the world knew it. Shields rang like thunder, horns sounded over the fjords, and warriors painted in blood and iron descended upon towns and temples. Their war was spectacle open, brutal, and designed to be remembered. But in the forest, the rules of war changed. The forest people fought with no banners, no ranks, and no songs of victory. Their warfare was not a clash of armies, but a quiet art, an ambush in the snow, a stone trap reset without a sound, a spear that flew from the trees and vanished as quickly as its wielder. To the Vikings, who prized honor in open battle, these tactics were unnerving, alien, but they were not cowardly. They were perfect. Perfect for a land of darkness, silence, and shadow. The first Viking accounts of forest combat are not detailed. They appear in sagas as warnings, not stories. In Orkneyinga saga, a young chieftain recalls how his father died on an inland expedition. The trees moved, he says, and men died who never saw the edge that cut them. In Hafenkel's saga, a group of travelers is warned not to camp near the hollow hills, for the ones who guard the forest do not sleep as men do. These phrases might be dismissed as poetic were it not for the archaeological evidence that supports them. At the edge of the Kemi River Valley, a mass of sharpened stakes was discovered beneath a collapsed thicket. Dated to the 9th century, the stakes had been buried at an angle, point upward, beneath a path commonly used by herding animals and by humans on snowshoes. They formed a crude but effective trap, nearly invisible under powder snow, deadly to anything heavy enough to fall through. Nearby, Notched stones marked the presence of a blind, a low, bark-covered hideout set behind a ridge, perfect for launching arrows down onto the trail. These were not defensive structures. They were tools of the hunt. But in the hands of the forest people, hunting and warfare became one and the same. To understand how they fought, we must understand how they lived. The forest people rarely gathered in large numbers. Their families were small, scattered, and constantly on the move. Their survival depended on remaining unnoticed. But when threatened, when Viking expeditions pushed too far inland, or when settlers tried to clear sacred groves, they responded with speed, precision, and ruthlessness. They used the forest itself as a weapon. They baited paths with false tracks, lured invaders toward frozen lakes with thin ice, and used ravens whose calls they imitated expertly to signal movement across distance. They fought not in daylight, but in dusk and snowstorms, not with open aggression, but with disappearance. Their weapons were simple but effective. Spears made of fire-hardened ash or birch, with heads of sharpened bone or stone. Shortbows crafted from twisted yew or mountain birch, light enough to use from a sled or treetop, but powerful at close range. Arrows fletched with owl feathers for silent flight. The arrowheads were often barbed, designed not to kill instantly but to cripple and bleed. A Viking warrior struck in the leg or back would fall screaming easy prey for the next shot. They also used clubs, not clumsy bludgeons, but carved tools balanced for a single stunning blow. One such club, recovered from a swamp in eastern Finland, was shaped like a deer's jawbone, its edge reinforced with river stone and hide. It was worn smooth by years of handling, a weapon made not for massed battle but for silent, up-close dispatch. Their armor was the forest itself. Layers of hide, bark, and moss made them nearly invisible. They wore hoods that broke the line of the head and cloaks that blended with underbrush. In winter, they reversed their clothing white on the outside, ash-dusted to match the snow. A Viking standing still might not notice one watching from 10 paces away. One saga tells of a Norse party crossing a pine valley in midwinter. At sunset, the light grew strange. One of their men vanished, then another. No sound, no trail. When they fled, they claimed the trees had eyes. They were not wrong. The forest people knew every tree, every hollow, every sound the wind should or should not make. They knew where footfalls echoed, where frost cracked beneath weight, where breath misted too brightly. To them, an armored Norse warrior was not fearsome. He was loud, slow, and blind. The Vikings never understood how few they faced. Some scholars estimate that no more than a few dozen forest warriors ever engaged a raiding party at a time, and even then, only when provoked. Their goal was never conquest or defense, it was deterrence. To make the forest feel cursed, to make the invaders believe the land itself rejected them, and it worked. Over time, certain areas were simply abandoned by Norse settlers. Tracts of forest were declared forbidden by custom, if not by law. Even in times of hunger, hunters refused to follow reindeer trails into the deep pine belts. Rumors spread not of men but of beings, spirits, ghosts. But the truth was simpler and more powerful. They were not spirits. They were not shadows. They were men and women who had mastered a form of warfare designed not to dominate but to dissolve, who struck only when necessary, and then vanished like wind through branches. To fight them was not to win or lose. It was to never be sure they were there. Part 11. Runestones of Warning. Scattered across the Old Norse world, from the windswept ridges of central Sweden to the edge of the Gulf of Bothnia, stand the weathered remnants of runestones, slabs of granite inscribed with names, deeds, prayers, and sometimes fear. These were the Viking Age's monuments to memory. They honored the dead, marked territory, and proclaimed legacy. But a handful of these stones do something else. They warn, not of enemies in longships or foreign kings across the sea, but of the forest. The runestones of warning are few, and their messages are cryptic. Their language, etched in the looping elegance of the younger Futhark, speaks not to glory but to caution. And where most runestones stand in clearings or near roads, these particular stones are different, placed near woodland trails, river forks, or the edge of deep groves thresholds into the wild. One such stone stands near the border of modern-day Helsingland, in a forest where few farms ever took hold. Its inscription, weathered and worn, has been partially translated. Here ends the Hall Road. Beyond lies silence. Beware the watchers who mark no guest. No enemy is named, no battle remembered, and yet the message is clear. What lies ahead is not meant for the living. Another, found on the edge of the Ångerman River Valley, features a more chilling warning. Set beside a path that once led into a dense pine tract now lost to modern roads, it reads, Björn carved this after his brothers fell. The forest remembers. Do not follow. The stone is unadorned, no dragon heads, no border work, just a name, a death, and a plea. Who Björn's brothers were, and how they died, remains unknown. But the very need to place a marker speaks volumes. This was no superstition. This was a boundary drawn in stone. Runestones like these are often dismissed by historians as products of folklore, symbols of local fears, not actual events. But recent excavations at their locations have unearthed more than stories. Charred remains of camps, shattered arrowheads of bone, and oddly symmetrical patterns of stone suggest sudden abandonment, hasty flight, perhaps even ambush. One particular site near Jämtland contains both a runestone and a nearby clearing filled with broken tools, sled parts, iron cooking hooks, and wooden shields snapped down the middle. It appears someone tried to establish a winter outpost here, and someone or something ended it. Local Sami oral tradition recalls this very glade. They call it Ravnuotka, the place of vanished voices. The tale, passed from elder to elder, tells of a group of Norse settlers who entered the forest seeking to trade for furs. They were warned not to camp near the frozen lake. They did so anyway. That night, the wind changed, and their fire died without cause. In the morning, only the snow remained unbroken. No bodies, no tracks, just the echo of footsteps that went nowhere. It is easy to dismiss such stories, but when they align with physical remains, with abandoned camps, with weapons scattered and untouched, the line between myth and history begins to blur. Why would the Norse, a people famed for courage, place such warnings? Because courage and wisdom are not the same. The forest was not their world. It belonged to others who made no claim to land with stone or sword, but whose presence was undeniable. The runestones were not admissions of defeat. They were acknowledgments of reality, markers to tell future travelers, here is where the map ends. These warnings were also, in a way, offerings. By naming the danger, the Norse tried to bind it, to keep it at bay. Naming had power in their culture. Runes were not merely letters. They were symbols of fate, magic, and intent. To carve a warning was to speak into the future, to say, we remember what happened here. May you avoid the same. Some stones are even more enigmatic. A small marker found near the coast of Norrbotten reads, we gave gifts and walked backward. The woods took them. Let that be enough. Scholars debate its meaning, but in many Arctic and northern shamanic traditions, walking backward is a ritual of departure, a way of showing respect, of not turning your back on something sacred or dangerous. It suggests a cultural exchange, one that went badly. What is most telling is the rarity of these stones. They were not scattered widely, nor repeated often, which suggests that the forest people did not provoke frequent war. They did not wage campaigns. Their message was simple: do not trespass. And the runestones are proof that the Norse listened. Not always, not everywhere, but enough to record it in stone. Today, these markers stand largely forgotten. Tourists pass them unaware. Few know to look beyond the inscriptions. But to the trained eye, they reveal a moment when Viking confidence met something older, quieter, and no less deadly. They are boundary stones not between tribes, but between ways of life. On one side, the sword, the ship, the hall. On the other, the bow, the snow, the shadow, and the stone between them says only this: do not go. Part 12. Trade, tribute, or threat. For all their ferocity, the Vikings were pragmatists. They knew when to fight and when to offer silver. Their world was built not only on battle, but on barter. And while most histories remember the Norse as raiders, their expansion was also driven by trade: amber for silk, furs for silver, slaves for wine. But what happens when trade encounters something it cannot dominate? The forest people were not merchants in the traditional sense. They built no ports, minted no coins, and erected no stalls in market squares. But they possessed something more valuable than gold: control over the deepest interior, the source of the rarest goods. The Vikings needed what the forest could provide, and so they came with goods to offer. In the sagas and trade records of early Norse settlements along the northern rivers, particularly in Upland and Helsingland, there are cryptic mentions of those who bring the white fur and keepers of the winter path. These terms refer not to named tribes, but to roles: the silent traders who appeared with goods and vanished before nightfall. The Norse would wait at designated sites, usually riverbanks or clearings marked with stone or carved wood. They would place their wares: beads, knives, wool, small iron tools. Then they would step back. If the offering was accepted, new goods would appear in its place hours later: bundles of ermine and sable, dried mushrooms, spruce resin, antlers carved with uncanny precision. There were no handshakes, no haggling, just exchange. This system, known later in other cultures as silent trade, relied on mutual interest and mutual fear. Neither side wished to provoke the other. The Vikings feared ambush, the forest people exposure, and yet this silent commerce persisted. In fact, some of the finest northern furs found in Norse burials, particularly those in high-status graves in Birka and Oseberg, likely came through such exchanges. The quality was beyond what Norse trappers could manage. These furs were clean, pliant, and expertly cut the work of a people who lived in constant daily relationship with their prey. But trade was only part of the story. There are signs the Norse sometimes paid not for goods but for permission. In the Landnamabok, the Book of Settlements, an early explorer named Ketil Flatnose notes that his cousin Haldur attempted to settle beyond the river called Blatha, Blood River. He built a small hall and began clearing land. Within the year, his livestock vanished. His men began to suffer strange fevers. One morning, they awoke to find birch branches arranged in an X across their longhouse door. They left. The next time Norse traders entered that region, they brought gifts, not trade goods, but offerings: reindeer meat, honeycomb, and a carved walrus tusk. They left them at the same spot Haldur had camped. They were not disturbed. What does this suggest? Tribute. Not in the imperial sense, but as a gesture, a way of saying, we recognize this land is not ours. It was not surrender. It was acknowledgement. In many shamanic and animist cultures, such gifts are not bribes but contracts. They affirm balance. By giving, the Norse affirmed their intent was not conquest, but coexistence, however temporary. But there were lines that could not be crossed. In one particularly chilling account from a later saga, a group of Norse traders attempted to follow the forest people back into the woods. They believed there must be a village, a place to seize, or at least map. The men vanished. Weeks later, their sleds were found in a ring, their goods untouched. No blood, no tracks, just a carved bone hanging from a tree, etched with a spiral. It was not a threat, it was a message. You do not follow. The relationship between the Norse and the forest people was always uncertain, a tightrope of necessity and caution. To the Norse, these people were valuable but unpredictable. To the forest dwellers, the Norse were powerful but reckless. And so the exchanges continued, measured, infrequent, and unspoken. Even today, in some of the oldest market towns of Sweden and Finland, local legends speak of Tistkupmen, quiet merchants, who came only at night and left no footprints. Some say they were elves, others, spirits, but it is far more likely they were real people, forest traders, who knew that to speak was to be seen, and to be seen was to risk everything. There are no surviving treaties, no Norse laws concerning these exchanges, but in the material record, the truth persists. In the beads found far from any settlement, in the knives made by Norse smiths, and found in bogs beside forest dwellings, in the uncut amber, buried with bones wrapped in bark. Trade happened, tribute was offered, and always a line remained. The forest people did not want to be known. They wanted respect, and when they received it, they gave in return. But when that line was crossed, when the Norse forgot to leave offerings, or tried to force access to trails best left untouched, then the trees remembered, and the forest responded. Part 13. Myths built on memory. By the time Icelandic scribes began to ink the sagas onto vellum, the forest people had already disappeared, not in battle, not by conquest, but into myth. Yet they were remembered, not by name, not in chronicles or censuses, but in the stories told beside hearth fires, in the symbols carved on wood, and in the silent warnings passed between generations. As the Norse world became increasingly Christian and literate, the living memory of the forest people was compressed, transformed until it no longer resembled history at all. It became folklore, and in that transformation, truth was not lost. It was transfigured. They became the Huldafolk, the hidden people. Elves, some would say. Others, land spirits or vatir. But beneath the supernatural skin, one can still glimpse the silhouette of real beings, those who walked the forest, traded in silence, and vanished before being understood. In the Islendinga bók and various post-saga folk traditions, Huldufolk are described as humanoid but elusive. They live in hills or woods, speak in strange tongues, and do not age as men do. They are indifferent to gold but react violently when their land is disrespected. Sound familiar? These weren't fairies in the Celtic sense. They were echoes distorted, reinterpreted of forest people who lived parallel to the Norse, but never among them. One of the most revealing examples appears in the saga of Bosi and Heraud. In a passage describing a cursed forest, the characters speak of the people who live beneath the bark, whose eyes reflect fire, and whose feet leave no track. They are said to know all paths, all herbs, and all songs of animals. They cannot be fought, only avoided or appeased. The saga does not call them elves. It calls them skogsmen, the very same term used in older accounts of the forest dwellers. Why would Viking Age authors begin to treat a real people as myth? Because memory, once severed from fact, naturally drifts into story. And the more unnerving the reality of people who refused to be seen, who moved without sound, who struck without being struck, the more the mind seeks to explain it with the language of the supernatural. And in that shift, something remarkable happened. The forest people were not demonized. They were sanctified. In Norse culture, elves were not frivolous spirits. They were dangerous, sacred, intertwined with land, fate, and fertility. They received offerings. Their territories were marked and protected. To anger them was to invite misfortune, not just individually, but across generations. This aligns perfectly with how the Norse had treated the forest people when they were still flesh and blood, leaving tribute, avoiding sacred groves, and warning others not to follow too deeply into the woods. Even the aesthetics of myth align with material evidence. Traditional depictions of Huldufolk show them wearing bark-colored clothing, deer-hide cloaks, and bone jewelry. These are not flights of imagination. They are descriptions drawn, consciously or not, from centuries of real encounters, diluted, stylized, but rooted in lived truth. Over time, the distinctions faded. The real people, the reindeer riders, the silent traders, the ghosts with spears became one with the forest itself. They transformed from a rival culture into a spiritual presence. And so they survived the only way a people can survive without history books or carved stones. They became the forest. In rural Finland, even today, older generations still speak of Metsänväki, the forest folk. They are described much like the Huldufolk, quiet, reclusive, unpredictable, not evil, but easily offended. Children are taught not to whistle in the woods, not to step over old stumps without apology. These customs are not Christian. They are remnants of something older, a code of respect, once directed at real people who could hear such offenses. The myth is not random. It is a softened memory of encounter, a collective agreement to never forget what the forest once held. And in that way, the forest people achieved something most empires never do. They became eternal, not as rulers, not as builders, but as myths that endure. Their lives, lost to the pages of history, found preservation in the roots of story. They are remembered not by name, but by pattern, not by date, but by the tension one feels when the trees grow too quiet. Every culture, at its core, remembers the ones who lived before, the ones who moved differently, who refused to be tamed, who understood something we forgot. In Norse lands, they were not erased. They were transformed into warning, into wonder, into the hush that falls over the woods when the snow begins to fall. Part 14. Spiritual Power and Shamanic Practices. In the Norse imagination, power came from bloodlines, blades, and the will of gods who demanded sacrifice. Their priests and priestesses, the Gothar and Volur, invoked the divine with fire and song, calling upon Odin, Freya, and Thor to bless battle and birth. Their rites were loud, dramatic, public. The forest people worshipped differently. There were no temples, no sacrifices of livestock or warriors bound on altars. Their spiritual world was quiet, woven into the trees, the rivers, the moss that crept along ancient stones. Their gods, if they had names at all, lived in the marrow of the land, and the ones who spoke to them, shamans, not in the modern misused sense of the word, but in its original form, no-itis, in the later Sami traditions, figures who walked between the worlds, who carried the breath of the forest into the body, and returned with knowledge that could not be learned by watching the stars or listening to the wind alone. These shamans, women and men, did not wear crowns or carry staffs of gold. Their power was not given by bloodline, but by proximity, to death, to pain, to the rhythm of the unseen. They were healers, seers, dreamwalkers, and they bore the signs of it in their very bones. At a dig near the upper reaches of the Kitka River, archaeologists unearthed a burial unlike any other in the region. The body was curled in a fetal position, wrapped in birch bark, and surrounded by antlers arranged in a ring. In the center of the chest lay a drum reindeer hide stretched over a carved wooden frame, with symbols etched into its surface: sun wheels, animal tracks, and a double spiral like a vortex. Nearby, a pouch contained the remains of dried mushrooms, likely Amanita muscaria. Another held ground charcoal, pine resin, and a mixture of herbs still unknown to science. This was not an ordinary burial. It was ascending. Whoever this person was, they were more than a healer. They were a conduit. Shamanic traditions across the circumpolar north share certain traits, and it's likely the forest people carried similar beliefs. They saw the world as layered: this world, the underworld, and the sky world, all connected by roots and rivers. The shaman could travel between them, but never freely. Each journey required preparation, sacrifice, and risk. It began with the drum. Its rhythm mimicked the heartbeat of the earth: slow, steady, then faster, like hooves across snow. Shamans used the beat to enter trance, aided by herbs or mushrooms, and in that altered state they would see visions: the illness of a child as a serpent, the approach of a storm as a cracked tree falling in reverse, the spirits of ancestors guiding a hunter through dangerous terrain. These weren't metaphors. They were the language of the forest people's spiritual grammar, a symbolic logic as real to them as law codes were to the Norse. Forest shamans were also marked by what they wore: antlered headdresses not for performance but for transformation. To become the animal was to know it, to wear the skin of a lynx, to walk like a bear, to call like an owl. This was not mimicry. It was communion. Some scholars believe these rituals formed the basis of later Norse tales of shape-shifting and berserker rage. But where the Norse used trance to stoke fury in war, the forest people used it to listen, to receive, to balance. Their medicine, their divination, and their rites of passage were all entangled with their shamanic worldview. A girl entering womanhood might be blessed under a sacred pine. A boy leaving childhood might walk alone into the snow, watched only by spirits, to return bearing a sign: a feather, a vision, or a name only the shaman would understand. Dreams were crucial. They were not idle thoughts, but messages. A hunter who dreamed of falling into ice might cancel a journey. A mother who saw a red stag might name her son for it, believing it had chosen him. To the Norse, these practices were unnerving. Some sagas describe encounters with forest dwellers who spoke to beasts, or who bled without dying. These are likely misinterpretations of trance states, healing rituals, or even surgical knowledge unknown to the Norse. But lacking an explanation, the Vikings turned to the only one they knew: magic. And so the forest people became witches, enchanters, spirits of the land. But the truth was simpler and more powerful. They were shamans in the truest sense, not spellcasters, but intermediaries between seen and unseen, between the forest and the firelight. And they wielded a kind of spiritual authority the Vikings could neither match nor fully understand. Even today, echoes of these practices survive. Among some Samijoikare, traditional singers, songs are still used not for entertainment, but for transformation. A joik is not sung about a person or place, it is that person or place. It becomes them. In a culture descended in part from the forest people, the line between identity and ritual remains porous. The forest, too, remembers. In untouched glades, certain stone circles still stand overgrown, silent, undisturbed, not graves, not altars, but ritual sites, places where the veil between worlds thinned and the antlered ones walked. There were no temples, because the forest was the temple. No gods carved in stone, because divinity lived in the root, the flame, and the breath of the drum. Part 15. The Snow Veil Technique. Winter in the boreal north is not a season. It is a force. For months, snow blankets the world in silence. It smooths the land, disguises dangers, and smothers all but the surest steps. In such a landscape, survival depends on one's relationship to the snow, not merely enduring it, but moving through it as though it were an extension of the body. The forest people knew this intimately. They didn't just walk through winter, they vanished into it. The Norse spoke of it with awe and unease. Their sagas make passing references to snow trails that end without explanation, hunters who follow tracks and find only emptiness, scouts who swear they heard movement on the wind but saw no one. These are not tales of ghosts. They are accounts of a perfected art, the snow veil technique. Though the name is modern, the practice is ancient, a tactical and spiritual approach to winter movement refined over generations. At its core, it is the manipulation of environment, perception, and form to become indistinguishable from the winter world, neither hiding nor running, but becoming snow. Let us begin with their method of travel. While Viking boots were thick and fur-lined, they were no match for deep snow. The forest people developed specialized snowshoes, oval or teardrop-shaped frames made from flexible birch, interlaced with rawhide or sinew. These allowed even the smallest person to move across snowdrifts without breaking the crust. But beyond mobility, the snowshoes served another purpose: silence. Unlike wooden soles, these shoes absorbed sound. A hunter could pass within 10 paces of a Viking patrol without a crunch or snap. Some snowshoe designs even curved upward slightly at the heel, not for speed, but to avoid catching on debris and leaving broken trails. And they did not walk in lines. Forest people moved in staggered paths. A leading figure followed loosely by others who intentionally avoided stepping into the same prints. This scattered their trail, confused pursuit, and mimicked the movement of elk or deer, misdirecting both human and animal trackers. But the snow veil technique was more than equipment. It was a philosophy. They read the snow like scripture. A shift in texture meant warming air. A sudden silence in the forest signaled a predator or an intruder. The quality of snowfall itself mattered. Wet snow muffled movement. Dry snow amplified it. They adjusted their pace, gait, and breath accordingly. They moved with the snow, not through it. Their clothing was layered with intent. Inner garments were of soft fur for warmth. Outer layers, often made from reindeer hide or rabbit pelts, were whitewashed with lichen ash and snow mud. Cloaks were reversible. One side a mottled gray, white to match the forest in early snow, the other a cleaner ivory for deep winter. Hoods extended to obscure the face's shape. With slits so narrow, they revealed only the eyes dark against the snow, but concealed under overhangs of bark or ice. Some wore cloaks lined with crushed bark and dried moss. This not only insulated it, broke the outline of the body. To a distant observer, they did not look like men at all. They looked like drifted trees, low boulders, or mounds of wind-packed ice. And when they stopped moving, they disappeared. This was the heart of the technique. Stillness. A forest person could remain crouched behind a pine trunk for hours without shifting weight. Breathing was slowed, hidden behind bark or snow-packed fabric. Their weapons, often light bows or bone-bladed spears, were wrapped in cloth to avoid glint and clatter. Even the bowstrings were treated with resin to prevent creaking in cold air. In deep snow, they sometimes dragged small branch bundles behind them tied to the ankles with sinew to erase prints as they moved. Others carried birch branches to brush over their path before doubling back in a pattern that made it appear they had never been there. In open fields, they used snow-blind terrain, sun-glared slopes, and wind-swept ridgelines to dazzle pursuers. They moved when light was lowest, during blue hour, when even the shadows seemed to glow. In these moments, the Norse feared them most, not because they attacked openly, but because they appeared suddenly, as if conjured from the snow. A sentry might feel eyes on him, scan the horizon, and see nothing. Then a spear would fly not from the trees, but from a shape that moments ago was just another snowbank. It wasn't supernatural. It was the apex of environment-adapted stealth. Even their temporary shelters honored this principle. Snow huts' crude igloo-like structures were built not high, but low, nestled into banks, with air vents hidden beneath piled brush. From a distance they looked like nothing, and when abandoned they were collapsed and swept clean, leaving behind no trace but frozen ground. The snow veil technique was also a spiritual practice. To move without leaving a mark was a sign of harmony. In shamanic terms, snow was not an obstacle, but a living boundary. It separated the profane from the sacred. To pass over it without disturbing it was to prove one's belonging, to prove one was of the forest, not merely within it. In this, their shamans led by example. Some wore cloaks of owl feathers and winter symbols of silence. Others walked barefoot over snow in rituals to read the sleeping world, trusting the cold not to harm them if they moved with respect. These practices blurred the line between body and world, between step and spirit, and so they vanished. Not in the sense of fading, but in the deeper sense of ceasing to be separate from the world around them. To the Vikings, who valued visibility, the shining sword, the towering ship, this was alien. To fight an enemy you could not see, who left no challenge and no trail, was worse than dishonor. It was humiliation, and perhaps that was the point. The snow veil was not just a survival tactic. It was a message. We are here. You will not find us. And when you try, the snow will take your memory of us too. Part 16. The Terror of Silence. It is said that what the Vikings feared most was not death, but dishonor. They embraced the clang of steel, the scream of battle, the hot breath of a dying foe. Their songs glorified the chaos of war, the spilling of blood under open sky. But in the forests of the far north, there were no songs, no witnesses, no warriors dying with swords in hand, only silence. And that more than cold, more than beasts, more than gods, was what terrified them. The silence of the forest people was not empty. It was active, weaponized. In the deep woods, sound did not carry. A fallen branch might echo like thunder, or vanish completely into the moss. The forest could swallow you whole and leave no sign that you ever existed. The Norse, trained in the noise of battle, could not comprehend this. They had no answer for an enemy they could not see, hear, or name. Consider the account of Erik Ulfsson, a minor chieftain from the southern coast of Norway, whose winter expedition into the inland pine valleys is recounted in fragments by later scribes. His party, 30 men strong, had entered the woods seeking new hunting grounds and winter furs. They were seasoned warriors. They feared nothing. But by the third night, their songs had ceased. Something was wrong. Their sentries reported hearing movements soft, circling, like footsteps on powder snow. Once, a whisper. Another time, the faint creak of a tree where no wind blew. Then came the symbols, birch bark tied in knots and hung from branches, bone shards driven into tree trunks, silent signs that someone was watching. The next morning, one man was missing. No blood, no tracks, just a single set of boot prints, his own leading away from camp into the trees and ending in a smooth, undisturbed drift. Then another disappeared, and another. Panic set in, but no one could explain what was happening. There was no assault, no arrows, no challenge, just that same smothering, quiet, heavy as snow on a roof beam. Eric's survivors abandoned the expedition. When they returned to the coast, they refused to speak of what they'd seen, but one of their skalds, years later, recorded the tale as a warning. Steel is strong, but it echoes, and the forest does not echo. It listens. This terror, this war without noise became legend. Norse warriors began to fear the woods not as battlefield, but as judgment. There was no glory to be earned in a place where no one saw you die. No Valkyrie would carry you from a death that left no trace. It was said in some villages that the forest people did not kill, they took, that a man struck by their hand left no corpse, that his soul was absorbed into the trees, his name forgotten even by his kin. The forest, they whispered, could consume memory itself. These fears were more than superstition. They were born from real experience. A recurring detail in several Viking accounts is the sudden disorientation warriors felt when deep in forest terrain. Men would speak of becoming lost, despite knowing the path, of hearing footsteps that echoed their own, of fire refusing to burn properly, food turning sour without rot, animals avoiding traps they'd used for years. These were not mystical events. They were tactics, psychological warfare waged by a people who understood the mind as deeply as they understood the land. They chose their moments, letting a scout see them just once from a distance, appearing in a clearing, a figure in fur and bark, unmoving, and then vanishing before eyes could adjust, making noise just loud enough to be noticed, just quiet enough to be doubted. The effect was cumulative. Dread built over hours, days, no fight, no escape, just the growing certainty that you were not alone and never had been. Sri, the Vikings had words for enemies. Oven for a foe, Fianmother for someone hostile, but for the forest people they used a different term in certain regions. Holdumen, hidden men, the same root used for elves and unseen spirits. When language fails to name a threat, it becomes myth. Yet not all Norse feared them equally. The skalds, poets, and storytellers often hinted at an uneasy respect. Some even described the forest people as wise, ancient, closer to the gods. Odin himself, it was said, wandered the forests in disguise. Perhaps he sought them. Perhaps he feared them too. But among the common warriors, the fear ran deeper, a terror of being erased. Because in the end, what the forest people stole was not life but story. They gave no battlefield, no corpse, no memory to preserve in saga, just the silence. And in Norse culture, to be forgotten was the worst fate of all. So when the snow fell hardest and the woods grew still, Viking halls grew quiet. Fires burned lower, warriors drank deeper, and no one spoke of the pine groves beyond the fjord, not because they didn't remember, but because they did. Part 17. The Great Collapse. Fire and steel. No civilization vanishes without cause. Even those designed to disappear like the forest people cannot outrun the slow, grinding pressures of history. And while they evaded the sword, melted into the trees, and erased their footprints in snow, they could not forever resist the creeping reach of fire and steel. By the 12th century, their presence once feared, once whispered about in sagas, and stone begins to fade. The runestones fall silent. The silent traders stop appearing. The watchers in the forest no longer send omens or arrows. And the Norse, now Christianized and expanding inland with new purpose, begin to speak of these lands not as haunted, but as empty. But they were not empty. Something happened, and that something was collapse. Not a sudden slaughter or a single battle. Not the cataclysmic fall of an empire, for the forest people had no empire to fall. Their collapse was slow, uneven, and intimate. It came not from one enemy, but from many, all unconnected, all inevitable. The first was fire. With Christianization came churches, and with churches came the demand for cleared land, timber, and control. The monks and kings of Norway and Sweden, eager to convert and settle the untamed interior, began granting land rights to Norse families in regions once deemed uninhabitable. To clear the forest, they burned it. What the Vikings once feared, their descendants now set aflame. Records from monastic scribes in the 11th century describe the process in cold detail. Slash, burn, settle. Entire groves were reduced to ash in preparation for fields that rarely yielded enough grain to justify the destruction. But the goal wasn't only agriculture, it was dominion. Fire forced the forest people to retreat deeper. It destroyed not just habitat, but memory, sacred groves, migration paths, caches of tools, winter shelters hidden for generations, gone in a day of smoke. Then came the steel, iron axes, steel plows, mail shirts, and crossbows. The forest people who relied on stone, bone, and the flexibility of nature were now facing settlers armed with metal. Not just warriors, but farmers with iron nails and saws that could fell a pine tree in minutes. Even if they could avoid confrontation, they could not avoid consequence. The noise of tools, the brightness of metal in sunlit clearings, the stench of refuse and animals, all of it disrupted the careful silence they needed. The world was being reshaped by people who wanted to be seen, and still more enemies came. Trade routes shifted. Rivers once used for silent exchange now carried iron-bound boats loaded with salt, grain, and tithes. Christianity demanded visibility: churches, bells, records. The forest people had none of these. To the church, they were not only outsiders, they were heathens. Missionaries rarely reached the deep interior, but their influence spread through local lords, eager to prove piety. Some began organizing cleansings campaigns to root out remaining pagans. These were not military operations against armies, but hunting parties against whispers, against shadows. Few records of these survive. One, from a monastery in Ungerman land, mentions a band of silent heathen in the woods who did not kneel. They were purged, the monk writes. No number, no names, just purged. Disease followed. Even isolated, the forest people were not immune. With settlers came new illnesses: pox, fever, infection. Lacking immunity, small populations could be devastated in a season. One sick trader, one contaminated river, and a clan of 20 could vanish. There are burial sites shallow, hasty, and clustered from this period that suggest sudden death. Bodies laid in groups, wrapped in furs, with no grave goods, no ceremony. Perhaps their shamans had died first, leaving no one to perform the rites. And then came forgetting. As the last forest people disappeared into legend, their names faded, their trails were overgrown, their language, never written, died with the last elders who remembered it. Children of mixed ancestry were absorbed into Sami or Norse communities. Their stories, now dangerous to repeat, were softened into myth. The watchers became elves, the shamans became witches, the groves became haunted woods. Their collapse was not loud. It did not echo. It was a silence layered upon silence, a world of knowing dismantled not by force alone but by neglect. In the centuries that followed, settlers spoke of empty land. Kings granted titles to territories once avoided. The forest, now a resource, was stripped of its memory. And when someone did mention the old ways, the people who moved like snow, who traded without words, who vanished without sound, they were told it was superstition. But beneath the moss, the forest remembers. A broken snowshoe found lodged in a bog. A fire pit, long cold, filled with bones cut by stone. A pendant carved from reindeer antler, still strung with sinew. These are not ruins. They are whispers, remnants of a people who were never meant to be conquered, only respected. But respect was lost, and so they left, not in ships or flames, but into the ground, into the roots, into the pages of myth. The forest was not defeated. It was silenced. Part 18, Genetic Ghosts. You can erase names from memory, burn maps, and silence stories, but the body remembers. Long after the forest people disappeared from sagas, long after their trails faded, and their rituals turned to myth, something of them remained hidden in bone and blood, like seeds buried beneath frost. not history, not legend. Genetics. In recent decades, as the tools of population genetics have advanced, researchers have begun piecing together a puzzle that no chronicler ever recorded. By analyzing ancient remains, teeth, femurs, strands of hair from peat-preserved bodies, scientists have discovered something remarkable: a ghost population. Scattered across northern Scandinavia and the Arctic fringe of Europe are faint traces of a once distinct genetic lineage, not Norse, not Sami, not Slavic, something older, something apart. The first real clues emerged in the early 2000s, when DNA extracted from Mesolithic burials in northern Finland showed affinities with both Western Eurasian hunter-gatherers and distant Siberian groups, a unique blend that didn't fit the known models of Scandinavian ancestry. Then came the shock. That same genetic signal appeared, faint but persistent, in certain modern Sami populations. The implication was extraordinary. Somewhere in the forest bloodlines of the Sami, in the mitochondrial DNA passed down through generations, were echoes of a forgotten people, a lineage that had not entirely vanished, but had flowed silently into others, just as they had once moved silently through the snow. These findings matched archaeological anomalies, reindeer hunting sites in Lapland that predated known Sami settlement by centuries, bone tools with no cultural parallels, burial styles that defied Norse or Finno-Ugric patterns. It was as if a people had been passing through lightly, leaving just enough to be found, but never enough to be named. Some geneticists now refer to this mystery population as a ghost group, a term used when a group's genetic fingerprint exists, but their culture, language, and identity are otherwise lost. It is both a poetic and haunting phrase. But the forest people were not entirely ghosts, because their legacy survives not just in DNA but in physiology, in memory, in the lived experience of descendants who may not even know their full inheritance. A recent study analyzing the genomes of over 2,000 individuals from northern Fennoscandia found unique adaptations in lipid metabolism and cold resistance traits highly advantageous in Arctic environments. These genetic traits likely did not evolve in settled agricultural populations. They came from people who lived in forests and tundra, who endured long winters, who moved with the snow. They came from people like those who once vanished from the Viking eye. Even more intriguingly, certain oral traditions among Sami elders preserve fragments of memory that align with this ghost legacy. Stories of ancestors who never built lavu, Sami tents, but lived in pits, who did not herd reindeer, but followed the wild herds and moved as they did, who painted symbols on bark and sang to the trees. They are remembered not as a different tribe, but as a different kind of human, quieter, older, sacred. The Sami themselves, marginalized and misunderstood for centuries, have become the final vessel for this genetic whisper. They carry in their veins the last trace of a people who never sought to be remembered, only to endure. This revelation has sparked debate. Some historians resist the idea of resurrecting lost tribes from DNA. They warn of romanticizing or over-interpreting scant evidence. But for many indigenous researchers and Sami advocates, the findings affirm what oral tradition has always hinted, that their ancestors were not alone in the north. They were part of a layered human story, one where people came not to conquer the land, but to listen to it. And when the conquerors came, they didn't fight. They disappeared into the bloodstreams of those who still walk the forest paths. Geneticists call them ghosts, but perhaps they are better understood as echoes. Echoes of a way of life tuned so finely to the rhythms of the earth that it left no monuments, only movement. No empires, only blood. No sagas, only strands. In a world obsessed with what can be seen and counted, the forest people remain elusive. But the truth is this: they are not gone. They are here in the cells of children born under the northern lights, in the pulse of hunters who still follow ancient paths, in the quiet places where the forest has not forgotten how to listen. Part 19. What the forest remembers. If the forest could speak, it would not do so in words. It would speak in wind, in the bending of pine boughs under snow, in the slow thaw of spring sap rising through birch. It would whisper through the hooves of reindeer, crossing ancestral paths, in the silence of moss-covered stones untouched by axe or fire. And if you listened carefully, it might tell you, they were here. The forest remembers, not as humans do through dates and names, but through presence, through the way a certain glade remains unnaturally quiet, the way lichens grow more thickly on the stones of a ring never marked on any map, the way animal trails veer subtly around a hollow where nothing now moves. These are not superstitions. They are memory embedded in ecology. Some places still bear their mark, not visible ruins, but absences. A clearing where no trees grow, though soil is rich. A hillock where snow always lingers late, as if the cold will not leave. A stretch of river known to freeze thin, even in the deepest winter, avoided not because of danger, but because of stories. The locals won't call them sacred. They won't call them haunted. They will just say, we don't go there. Scientists and archaeologists have begun mapping these zones of silence regions within the northern forests, where evidence suggests prolonged absence of settlement or animal grazing, despite the land being fertile. Soil samples show signs of ancient fire use. Tree ring studies reveal abrupt changes in growth, as if the land was once used and then left, all at once. Some of these places correspond with known forest paths used in prehistoric migrations. Others, more curiously, overlap with stories preserved in Sami Joik, the chant songs that do not describe a place so much as become it. In one such joik, passed down through a single family in Kautokino, the singer recalls a place of heavy air, where the wind cannot rise, and the stars flicker strangely. The path through it, they say, was once made by those who no longer speak. It is not poetic metaphor. It is cartography of memory. Even animals seem to recall. In some areas, herds consistently avoid certain forest belts, bypassing them for generations despite no modern threat. When hunters enter these places, game vanishes. Traps remain empty. Dogs grow restless. The forest, somehow, knows. Perhaps this is fanciful, or perhaps not. The forest is not a passive backdrop. It is a living system, one shaped by human presence for millennia, and the forest people shaped it uniquely. They cut only what they needed. They moved seasonally, allowing regeneration. They buried their dead in ways that fed the soil. They planted no crops, but they cultivated relationships with game, with plants, with places, and the land remembers kindness. Unlike conquest, which scars and flattens, this way of life left a lighter mark, but not an impermanent one. When reindeer still follow ancient trails, when mushrooms still bloom where once sacred fire pits stood, when a child hears silence in a glade and feels watched, that is memory, not the human kind. The forest kind. Even in place names, the memory lingers. There are valleys called Tisland, silent land, streams named Glumdon, forgotten current, mountains with names that translate loosely to where no one goes. Each of these names, when traced back through dialect and regional history, points toward a people the chroniclers never saw, but whose presence the land still speaks. And then there are the trees themselves. In one forest in northern Västerbotten, an ancient pine stands alone in a clearing. Its lower trunk is marked with a series of shallow, crescent-shaped scars, not axe cuts, but careful scores where bark was once harvested for food or medicine. The cuts are evenly spaced, each about a hand's breadth apart. They rise like ribs. Tree ring analysis reveals the first cut was made over 800 years ago, the last about 200 years ago. No one knows who made the first mark, but someone did long before roads, long before the modern Sami herders moved through. That tree stands as a living timeline, each scar a testament to a visit, a hand, a ritual, and the tree remembers. What else might the forest recall? A song hummed in birch shade, the birth of a child beside a reindeer hide fire, the moment when a shaman, cloaked in snow moss, breathed pine smoke and vanished from the world for a time. These are not stories the forest tells aloud. They are impressions felt more than known more than explained. For the forest people did not build to be remembered. They lived to be in harmony, to pass like mist between the trees, to leave behind not monuments, but balance. And so the forest holds their memory not in stone, but in silence. When the wind stills and the snow falls straight, when the world quiets and the trees do not move, listen. You may not hear words, but the forest is speaking, and it remembers them. Part 20. Legacy of the Vanished. Why their story matters now. In a world driven by spectacle, by conquests, monuments, and the written word, the forest people offer a different legacy, a quieter one, not carved in stone, not passed down through empires or taught in schools, but alive still in the land, in the breath of stories, and in the blood of people who never claimed to remember them, yet carry their echo. Why does their story matter now? Because in their vanishing, they left behind a map, not of roads and cities, but of another way to live, one rooted not in dominion, but in relationship. Their world was not built to grow endlessly, nor to extract until collapse. It was built to endure carefully, invisibly, beautifully. They did not seek to be remembered through legacy, but through presence, to move lightly, to take what was needed, to know the seasons not as obstacles, but as rhythms of life. In this, the forest people offer a challenge to the modern world. We measure civilization by permanence. How tall, how loud, how long it lasts. But the forest people left no ruins because they never needed them. Their knowledge was in the wind, the tracks of animals, the whisper of a birch grove. Their greatness was not in war, but in mastery of silence. Not in what they conquered, but in what they never broke. They teach us that survival is not only about strength, it's about knowing when not to be seen. In an age where climate change threatens forests worldwide, where indigenous communities fight to protect what remains of their sacred lands, the story of the vanished forest people becomes more than history. It becomes warning and invitation. Warning of what is lost when we ignore those who live in balance with the land. Invitation to imagine other ways of being. Imagine if the forest was not a resource, but a relative. If silence was not absence, but presence. If being remembered did not mean being famous, but being in harmony. The forest people were erased by fire and steel, by the momentum of a world that could not understand them, but they were not defeated. Their memory survived in the DNA of the Sami, in the dreams of trees, in the hush of places no one dares build. And now, as their story is pieced together not just by historians but by archaeologists, geneticists, and indigenous knowledge keepers, they are returning, not as ghosts, but as teachers, in the echo of birch bark drums, in the smoke of pine resin, in the silence between snowfall and dawn. Their legacy is not in what they left behind, but in how they lived. And that perhaps is the most enduring story of all, because it means they never truly vanished. They are here in the forest, waiting for us to remember.